So last year I made a couple of videos about the Austrian elections. You may recall the first election in May was very close, and because of voting irregularities they had to hold another vote later in the year. At the time I noted the striking divide between the voting patterns of men and women. 60% of men voted for the right-wing candidate that wanted to impose strict limits on immigration, and 60% of women voted for the left-wing candidate Van der Bellen, who wanted no restrictions on immigration. More significant was how skewed the vote was amongst young women aged between 16 to 29, of which 67% voted for the left-wing pro-immigration Van der Bellen. Now, in the rerun of the election in December, the vote swung towards Van der Bellen. The female vote increased from 60 to 62%, and the male vote from 40 to 44%. And the vote of young women increased to 69%, from 67% in the previous election. Now, I made another video at that time called the Gender Voting Gap covering these results, and also showed a graphic from NPR which showed pre-polling data on the voting preferences of men and women in the US. As you can see, women were actually more likely to vote for the GOP through the Eisenhower era and even in 1960. It was men that swung it for Kennedy. Women still preferred the GOP by a small margin. Since then, women have been consistently more likely to vote left than men, with the exception of 1976, when both men and women preferred Carter at about the same rate. And since 1992, women have always preferred the Democratic candidate. The 2016 election saw the widest margin ever between male and female voting preferences. Now, obviously, Trump's candidacy was unique as his treatment of women became an issue. But still, the move by women to the left over the past 50 years has been unmistakable. Now, until recently, I didn't have any data on Australian voting patterns by gender, but Bettina Arndt penned an excellent piece in The Australian on Saturday titled "Women Take Sharp Turn to the Left in Expressing Political Convictions," and she appeared on Peter Credlin's show on Friday to discuss her findings.
So I wrote a column a little while ago in the Daily Telegraph. I looked at last year's election data, and women 18 to 64 years of age, only 35% voted for the coalition, voted for Malcolm Turnbull, let's say. Mm-hmm. And previously it had been in the 40s under Tony Abbott and in the 40s under John Howard. If 35% of women at last election voted for the party, that means that 65% of the Australian female electorate did not vote for the centre-right side of politics. Now, I got the what's happening. You're going to tell me the why it's happening. Why is it happening?
I mean, this was the fascinating thing, because there's academic papers everywhere talking about this shift. No one talks about what's actually going on.
That's why I'm fascinated.
Yeah, and I had got this fantastic data from this Australian election study you mentioned, but I got them to look at the trends and to differentiate between males and females. What they find is it's all driven by university graduates. That's what's causing the shift left, and particularly the females. Now, there's this fantastic graph, I don't know whether we can show it, which is all about self-defined political orientation. Do you regard yourself as left or right wing? And you find here, well, we can see it in a minute.
We'll just pop it up on the screen if you don't mind. We'll put the graph up and we'll talk to that.
But essentially what we'll see is a very level graph for the males. The blue line is the males. So they've gone... they come out of uni a little bit more left-wing, and women come out incredibly much more left-wing.
So just so for the viewers can follow that at home, the women are the red line, and you're right, there's a very dramatic shift up, and there's a great gap distance if you look at the 2016, sort of 2013.
Over 2 decades.
There's a big drift of women.
Big drift of women. And so why is this? Why would universities be affecting women differently from men? And we've had a lot of studies looking at what is being taught in our universities. Women are now 60% of university graduates, and they're mainly taking humanities subjects, which are absolutely captured by postmodernist claptrap, by ideological, neo-Marxist philosophy. And, the men are more likely to be doing the science subjects where there isn't the same ideological bias, if you like. And I mean, what the evidence shows is that that is doing something in terms of you can see the girls coming out of universities differently from the boys.
So Bettina Arndt kindly shared some of the data from the Australian electoral study, and the data shows a growing divide amongst men and women on a variety of questions. For example, on the question of do trade unions have too much power, men and women were very similar in their views until the last decade, and then the sexes started heading in opposite directions. On the question of favouring tax cuts over spending on social services, men seem to have regained a modicum of common sense in recent years. However, a record number of women prefer more spending on social services. Because remember, women are strong and independent and don't need no man, but for some reason they need more government services paid for by predominantly male taxpayers. Also, as Bettina Arndt points out, the number of single-parent families, of which more than 80% are headed by the women's, has grown from 13% in 1991 to 16% in 2016. And about 42% of sole-parent households live primarily on government benefits. Now, the article also talks about the effect of younger women. Jill Shepherd of ANU says the data shows that it's young female graduates who are pushing the drift left. Male graduates are not particularly more left-leaning than men without a university education, whereas female graduates are notably more left-leaning than other women without degrees. It's easy to see female graduates are an important factor explaining the overall shift to the left. In 2007, only 27% of Australians described themselves as having left-leaning views. By last year, that had leapt to 37%, 44% for graduates and 48% for those with postgraduate degrees. Academics writing on the issue usually cite university education as a key factor in influencing the growth of left-wing female voters without asking any of the hard questions about the type of education these women are receiving. Academics are unlikely to want to discuss this issue because there's abundant evidence that most are left-wing themselves. They are hardly going to be concerned that universities are churning out women who share their beliefs, says Bella Debrera, who has just completed an audit of history teaching at Australian universities for the Institute of Public Affairs. And you can check out my video on that by clicking the link in the top corner of the screen. The audit found that the subject is being taught from a narrow ideological perspective that focuses almost exclusively on class, race and gender, with hardly a word on democracy, liberalism, capitalism, the essential tenets of Western civilization. Students are being shamelessly indoctrinated into neo-Marxist beliefs, and their education is failing to provide them with the broad knowledge of history which would encourage critical thinking, an openness to conversation rather than conscription to a fixed set of ideas. It's not just history. The humanities and teaching faculties which attract most female students are now tarred with the same postmodern feminist and neo-Marxist brush. An astonishing 98% of our 43 universities now offer gender studies, which show a similar bias. This week, a new analysis of 165 university policies by the IPA revealed 81% of Australia's 43 universities had policies that were hostile to free speech, while a further 17% threaten free speech. Universities are schooling women in the language of identity politics, and by the time they graduate, they are fully fledged social justice warriors. The result is an ever-growing female voting bloc with blinkered leftist views. Now, the old idea is that you lean left when you're young, but you swing back to the right when you get older, because you get a dose of real life and grow out of your leftist utopian fantasies. But
okay, we all know lots of people start off left-wing and then they change. A lot of men, particularly.
Mugged by reality. It's called,
why aren't women being mugged?
So that's an interesting point. So you're saying that over time, even when the men previously had been a little bit left-wing at the university, it moderates back to being more of the centre. You're saying that women come out of universities very much to the left and they stay that way. Is that right?
They stay that way. I mean, I picked this all up because I do online dating coaching, and I've got these clients who are just impossible when it comes to their political views. They're so intolerant of conservative men. Any man who mentions, liking Tony, or one woman said, she has a pact with all her friends that no sex for anybody who likes Tony Abbott. But there's also, if you watch Andrew Bolt, if you watch Alan Jones, I'm sure you're on that list, then that means they won't go out with these men.
Really?
Just extraordinary. And men can have, varying political views, but they tend not to be as intolerant when it comes to their partners or their prospective partners, dating preferences.
Now, I think at this point it'd be very easy to conclude that women ruin everything. Throw up your hands and just go Galt. But that's not going to win the battle. So what to do about it?
How do you fight it?
You fight it in the university.
Milo's arguments, yeah, that's right.
That's what Milo is saying. That's where we have to start. We have to look at what is happening here in terms of teaching people a particular ideological perspective on the world, shutting down free speech, not allowing a diversity of attitudes on campuses. And Milo's been out there all this week preaching to huge audiences, predominantly young people, who are absolutely on side in that we have to take back the campuses. And we're organising great stuff for next year. I'm involved in, we want to bring Milo back and a whole range of other speakers that young people know, YouTube heroes, who are involved in trying to create more diverse university campuses.
Well, sign me up for that. So is it too late to rescue university campuses and stop Australia from becoming the next Sweden? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you next time.